Marc, it was 20 years ago when you and I sat down and we talked about crime in the criminal justice system, and I can remember before I interviewed you, I had interviewed Jesse Jackson. It was right after the crime bill was passed on President Clinton's administration, and Jesse's quote was, "The crime bill is a crime. It's a combination of Kool-Aid and cyanide. It will not reduce crime, but will be a boon to the prison industry." And I can also remember you warning everyone that with 3 strikes and you're out and mandatory sentences, that what we're going to be looking at in the future would be geriatric prisons and state budgets being bankrupt. I think both of you were quite prophetic at that time. Has violent crime really increased over, say, the last 10 or the last 20 years since the last time we talked about this?
Well, crime rates have actually gone down since the mid-90s or so. I think there's a lot of evidence that shows that it's not primarily because we put more people in prison, but many other factors, changes in policing, changes in the drug trade, community-based organizations, a bunch of things like that. So crime has gone down quite significantly, both violent and overall crime. At the same time, the prison population has continued to increase for much of that time, which seems sort of counterintuitive. You would think if crime were going down, we should have seen the prison population go down as well, and at least until the last several years, that hasn't been the case.
We've both heard the characterization of the military-industrial complex. Now it's not uncommon to hear about the prison-industrial complex. And I think when we talked before, about 2% of the prisons in our country were privately owned. I think about 7% now. Is the prison, is it a business? Is it a big business?
Well, unfortunately, part of it is. Yeah, actually, it's up to about 8 or 9% now. About 130,000 people, as we speak, are locked up in a private prison run either by states or the federal government. There's been a lot of research done. The private prison operators say, well, we can do it cheaper and we can get good results. The best research shows that sometimes it's a little cheaper, sometimes a little more expensive. Overall, there's no significant cost savings there. The problem is the private prison operators are running low contracts with the state. They have to outcompete them. They also are promising their stockholders they're going to make a profit off of it, so they got to build a profit margin in. So what that means is that very often they have staff who are not as experienced, staff who are not trained as well. Many of the states are actually very nervous about contracting with them, so they only give them prisoners who would be considered minimum security risk. They're really sort of concerned about giving them medium or high security risk, not sure they can handle it. Another problem that it brings on is that the private prison operators operate all over the country. So, for example, you might have, as is the case, a private prison in Arizona contracts with the state of Hawaii to hold overcrowded prisoners in Arizona. So they put them on a plane, they bring them to Arizona. Now they're an ocean away from their families, an ocean away from their attorneys. This is not a really good recipe for success, as we plan for people getting out of prison. So it's really been very much of a growth industry these last 20 years.
Mm-hmm. I can remember you expressing some real concerns about rural communities being so dependent upon prisons being built in their area as an economic development entity. Can you expound on that?
Yeah, well, prisons have always tended to be built in rural areas. Land is cheap primarily, but in the old days, if the corrections commissioner came to a rural town and said, we're going to build you a prison, they would have tried to run him out of town. In the last several decades, as these communities have lost their economic lifeblood, whatever manufacturing they had, many of their leaders are now going to state officials begging them for a new prison. They think this is a good way to get economic opportunity. So in many states, it's the economics that's driving the growth of incarceration. Even when prison populations start to decline, as they have in a number of states, New York State's a good example, they've had a 20% reduction in their prison population in the last decade. As they've tried to close prisons, they've run into a lot of resistance from those towns that have become very dependent on this as part of their economy. So the institutionalization of prisons in rural areas is a real stumbling block if we're ever going to see a significant reduction in the number of people behind bars.
Mm-hmm. I looked at some statistics online about arrest rates, and I can remember asking you about that 20 years ago. I think the statistic then was that 69% of every person who's arrested in the United States is white, but on any given day, 40% of the men that are incarcerated in the United States are African American.
Yeah, I mean, the only twist in the arrest statistics that the FBI keeps, they don't account for ethnicity. They can't incorporate Hispanics as a separate group. So it throws off our understanding a little bit. But if we look at incarceration, about 60% overall of people in prison are people of color, roughly 40% African American and about 20% Latino. The Latino numbers have been rising substantially, in part because there's more Latinos in the general population, in part because of criminal justice factors. But you know, you walk into any courtroom or prison in America, overwhelmingly it's a sea of faces of people of color, and it's been that way for quite some time now.
So the 30-some% that is deemed African American is really a compilation of both African Americans and Latino?
Most of Latinos would be counted within the white category, a relative handful as African Americans. So yeah.
We talked before about mandatory sentences and 3 strikes and you're out. Why don't we revisit the genesis of those laws? Take us back, and where are they at right now?
Well, the so-called tough on crime movement that began in the 1970s and 1980s was basically premised on something very simple. Let's get tough on crime by sending more people to prison and keeping them there for a longer period of time. And there's a whole range of policies that were put in place to do that. Mandatory sentences were premised on the idea first that you know, if you do the crime, you'll do the time. So lawmakers said, well, this will get people to think twice about a crime if they know that they're going to get a mandatory 5 or 10 years in prison. Also, they said, well, mandatory sentence means that nobody's going to get off of this based on their individual characteristics. You know, this will deal with disparity in sentencing. Well, neither of those ideas has worked out very well. When it comes to who gets a mandatory prison term, in fact, mandatory terms are not always mandatory. You know, the prosecutors have tremendous discretion, and they can choose to charge a crime as a mandatory or not, despite what the legislature may have thought was going to happen. Research from the U.S. Sentencing Commission on the federal system shows that white defendants are more likely to avoid being charged with a mandatory penalty than are African Americans. And that's about decisions made behind closed doors in a prosecutor's office. So it turns out they're not always mandatory. It also turns out that this one-size-fits-all approach to sentencing means that if you've got mandatory penalties of 10 and 20 years for certain drug offenses, yes, you will get some so-called drug kingpins who are sentenced on these harsh provisions, but you're also going to get some people at the very bottom of the drug trade who get caught up. One quick example, a guy named Weldon Angelos was a young music producer in Utah. He was caught on 3 separate occasions of marijuana sales to an undercover agent. On each of these 3 occasions, he also possessed a weapon. He had a gun hidden in his sock one time, another time in his pocket. He never used or threatened to use the weapon, but he had this. So when he came up for sentencing, on the first charge, he was sentenced, got a mandatory 5 years in prison because of the quantity of drugs he had. For charges number 2 and 3, he now fell under a provision whereby if you had a previous drug conviction and you had a weapon, you get a mandatory 25 years in prison. So he got 5 years plus 25 plus 25. Weldon Angelos is now serving 55 years in prison for 3 marijuana sales. That's what mandatory sentencing has brought us.
The last time you and I talked about cocaine sentencing disparity, there was a 100-to-1 ratio for crack versus powder cocaine. I believe recently that's been changed to an 18-to-1 ratio. What impact has that had, or has it had any impact at all?
Well, the crack cocaine laws passed by Congress in 1986 were set up so that if you sold 500 grams of powder cocaine, about a pound, you'd get a mandatory 5 years in prison. But for crack cocaine, all it would take was 5 grams, the weight of about 2 pennies, to get that same 5-year prison term. The way it played out, about 80% of the crack cocaine defendants were African American, resulted in huge racial disparities in incarceration. After about 20 years of challenge and building a movement for reform, 2010, Congress passed the Fair Sentencing Act, which reduced that 100-to-1 disparity in the drugs to 18-to-1. So it didn't equalize the penalties as many of us thought it should do, but nonetheless, the 18-to-1 substantially reduced the amount of time that at least some crack defendants were sentenced to in prison. So we now have fewer people serving these 5- and 10-year mandatory terms.
But wasn't the premise upon which you felt it should have been equalized the fact that they are both two forms of the very same drug?
Well, exactly. Crack cocaine is made from powder cocaine. You mix it with some baking soda, a little water, and you cook it, and then you get crack. So that means if I had 499 grams of powder cocaine, if I'm a sort of mid-level dealer, 499 grams, the most I can get is a year in prison. But if I then cook it and make it into crack and give it to you to sell in $5 and $10 bags on the street, if you're caught, you're going to get 5 years in prison. So I'm the guy with a lot of drugs, you're the guy with a little bit of drugs, and yet it's the same pharmacological substance, you're going to get more time in prison.
Mm-hmm. A former police commissioner for New York, Bernie Carrick, is getting a lot of attention right now, having ran afoul of the law himself and having served time in prison. And now he is really championing prison reform. In fact, I saw him at the recent CPAC Republican event there, and he said, quote, "Prison is a training ground for thuggery and criminality. You learn how to steal, cheat, lie, manipulate, gamble, and fight." And he went on to say there's no life skills or nothing that's going to help that individual walk the straight line once they get out. How do you respond to that?
Well, you know, it's interesting. I was with Mr. Carrick on a panel at a conference some 8 or 9 years ago. At the time, he was a high-ranking police official, and he was pretty tough. You know, he thought the war on drugs was just fine. He thought there were a lot of bad guys out there that deserved these harsh punishments. And to his credit, he went to prison, and he looked around at who was there and how they got there and what the impact of prison was, and it opened his eyes, I think. And I think I give him credit for being able to reflect on that experience. And I think in some ways, in the minds of some people, he has more credibility because of his law enforcement background, because he was a so-called tough guy all those years. I think he's coming out and speaking about what many people have certainly observed before, but fortunately he's got a different audience he can speak to, and I think he's helping to open up the dialogue because of that.
Mm-hmm. Here in D.C. of late, there's been a lot of media attention focused in on marijuana. Of course, that's happened quite in a number of places in Colorado and California and what have you. But here in D.C., there's a lot of debate and discourse going back and forth. What is the Sentencing Project's position on the decriminalization of marijuana?
Well, you know, we don't have a position for or against decriminalization of marijuana. We do think it's an important issue that needs to be addressed, that should play out at the state and local level. I think in terms of its impact, you know, there's some people who think if we decriminalized or legalized marijuana, we could deal with mass incarceration and empty the prisons. You know, it's not that simple. You know, people who are possessing, smoking small amounts of marijuana, they don't end up in a state prison for the most part. They may get arrested in large numbers, they may spend a couple nights in jail. I think the difference would be two things. First, it would free up a lot of police resources and court resources. You know, there's something like 800,000 people arrested for a marijuana offense every year, and the vast majority of those are very low-level crimes. So we'd free up a lot of police time to do more important things. Secondly, I think it helps open up the conversation about the war on drugs. You know, if we're reconsidering our societal attitudes about marijuana, what does it mean about other drugs, even harder drugs? You know, how much should our approach be one of criminal justice and punishment? How much should it be public health and treatment? You know, who makes those decisions? So I think it's very encouraging, this discussion that's going on now, and I think it's only going to help to open up that conversation.
Mm-hmm. You know, Bernie Carrick had talked about a felony conviction, no matter for how nonviolent that transgression may be, that it's a life sentence in terms of the huge amount of ramifications it has on the individual. What is your position on the reinstatement of voting rights, for example, which is just one example of one of the negatives that comes out of being a convicted felon?
Right. You know, people have often said you do the crime, you do the time, but, you know, the subtext there is your time never ends, basically. If you have a felony conviction, in many ways you have a lifetime sentence in terms of the consequences. One of the main ones is the loss of the right to vote. Today there are nearly 6 million people who are ineligible to vote because of a current or previous felony conviction. Only a quarter of those people are actually incarcerated in prison. The other 3/4 are living in the community under probation or parole supervision, or nearly 2 million of them have fully completed their sentence but live in one of the 11 states where a felony conviction may result in losing the right to vote for the rest of your life. So what we see is that in some states we've got huge numbers of people may actually be affecting actual electoral outcomes. Perhaps more importantly, if we think about public safety, recidivism, what is the message we're sending when we say to somebody, you know, you've done your time in prison, you've done your time on parole, we expect you to be a law-abiding citizen, but by the way, you're still a second-class citizen in the eyes of this community because we're not going to allow you to have a point of view when it comes to how we govern ourselves. I think that's a very harmful message. I think if we want people to play by the rules, we have to be willing to accept them. We have to get them connected with positive institutions, and one of those is participation in the electoral system.
Marc, I can almost hear a lot of people thinking out loud. We got 6.7% unemployment, some 10.5 million Americans out of work. Experts estimate that there's some 23 million underemployed people who are working hard and well under what their qualifications would qualify them for in terms of their salary and their wages. Why on earth should people care about the 2.2 million Americans that are locked up because they broke the law?
Sure. Well, if you want to start with the economics of it all, prison's very expensive. We spend about $80 billion a year to keep people behind bars today. You know, if those people are true threats to society, that's one thing. If they could be handled better in the community at far less cost, then that would free up huge amounts of funds to help pay for college education, to help provide mental health counseling, drug treatment, all kinds of services. So our bloated prison system is really robbing money from us. Secondly, it's a public safety question. You know, prison often makes people worse. It limits their job prospects, it puts a bad mark on their record, doesn't provide them with skills. So if we care about safety in the community, it's in everyone's interest that we do things that are more effective than just putting people in a cell and washing our hands, tell ourselves we've solved the problem. Finally, I think even in times of economic hardship, I think compassion needs to play a role here as well. We need to care about our fellow human beings, our neighbors. These are people who are going to be coming back to live in our communities, and the question is, how do they come back? Are they going to be more or less likely to lead a law-abiding life? So I think it's in everyone's interest that we care about it, even if we're not directly affected or don't see it that way.
Give us some context in terms of the total, 2.2 million Americans that are now incarcerated. What percentage of them are in there for violent crimes, rape, robbery, murder, armed robbery, I should say? Particularly in urban centers in major cities, you see crime story after crime story after crime story. Has violent crime really increased over, say, the last 10 or the last 20 years since the last time we talked about this?
Well, today of all the people in state and federal prisons, about half are there for violent crime, about half are there for a nonviolent property or drug crime. Even among the people there for violent crime, this includes people like the 18 or 19-year-old who gets involved in an armed robbery, and today he's 40 or 50 years old. He's in many cases grown up in prison, in many cases very different person than he may have been at the age of 18. As we keep these people in prison longer and longer, we are developing what we might think of as geriatric prisons. We have aging people, they have increasing costs of health care, they have diminishing likelihood they'd be involved in crime. So if you think about how do we want to spend our public safety dollars, do we want to keep people in prison 20, 30 years after they're any kind of risk to society at a cost that may approach $75,000 or $100,000 a year, or do we want to invest that with the 13, 14, 15-year-olds who are coming of age and likely to start getting involved in some criminal behavior unless we can intervene constructively. So yes, let's get the low-level drug offenders out of prison into treatment, but even the more serious offenders too, we need to take an individualized look and determine which of them are still a risk to the community today.
Did I read where there is a changing dynamic in terms of the racial component of the percentage of African Americans and whites that are now going to prison? Can you elaborate on that?
Research we've done at the Sensing Project shows some very intriguing shift over the last decade or so, particularly if you look at women in prison. In the year 2000, African American women were incarcerated at a rate about 6 times that of white women. A decade later, that disparity had been cut in half, so now African American women about 3 times the rate of white women. Now, on the one hand, that's still disturbing that we see such a ratio like that, 3 times as much, but the ratio has been cut, and it's come from 2 directions. First, fewer African American women in prison, but conversely, more white women are in prison. So what's going on there? Well, for African American women, it appears that this involves changes in the war on drugs. A number of states are now starting to adopt drug courts and other treatment mechanisms as an alternative to incarceration. Some states are reducing the amount of time drug offenders spend in prison if they participate in treatment programs in prison. So just as African American women were hurt by the drug war disproportionately, now as those populations go down, they're actually benefiting somewhat. For white women, conversely, some of it also reflects changes in drugs. As more people are locked up for prescription drug abuse and methamphetamine in some states, those tend to be crimes that whites and Latinos are more likely to be arrested for. So we're seeing a shift in that direction. Some of it's also, I think, changing socioeconomics, the impact of the recession, different parts of the country. Some white women, less educated white women, appear to have been hurt very dramatically by some of these changes, and so the risk factors for getting into trouble have increased for them, and then we're seeing more of a shift there. So to my mind, it's good news and bad news. I'm pleased that the racial disparities are declining in prison. It would be nice if we could see reduced numbers of both Black women, white women, Latinas, and others in prison. But right now, it's a very mixed trend.
You mentioned only females. What's happening on the male side?
Well, we're seeing some similar changes too, just not as dramatic. So the ratio between Black men and white men has declined, not quite as much, but it's gone down by about 10% over the course of a decade. I think it's likely some similar dynamics as we see with women, some of the shifts in the drug trade, drug involvement, drug sentencing, and the like. So, while these numbers are still shocking in many respects, I think it's encouraging. Many people have said, well, racism in the justice system is just intractable, we'll never be able to get a handle on it and do anything. I think these trends suggest that there may be some changes in policy and practice that we can promote, that we can push on to start to make a more substantial difference.
Mm-hmm. Marc, I participated in a leadership group not too long ago when I was living in West Virginia, and the entire forum was on the criminal justice system. There was a prosecuting attorney there, a defense attorney there, and a judge. And I stood there in front of all of my 80 classmates and the folks that attended that, and I basically said, if you wanted to see what I think is a microcosm of institutional discrimination and racism, look no further than the criminal justice system. And much to my amazement, even though I was quite nervous saying that, as only one of two African Americans in the room, every one of both the prosecuting, the defense attorney, and the judge all agreed, I mean, without hesitation, that the system is definitely racially skewed.
Well, you know, it's an interesting issue, I think, right? So, you know, 50 years ago, it was not unusual, especially in the South, but not only in the South, to hear, you know, openly racist comments made in the courtroom by the prosecutor, the judge, members of the jury, whatever, and there was no shame in doing so. So today, those kinds of outbursts, exclamation, those are pretty rare. People still may be racist, but they at least know you're not supposed to say these things publicly. So I think today what we're seeing, you can call it unconscious bias, you can call it how we use discretion, a lot of factors go into it, but what sets of decisions go into producing racial outcomes that are as skewed as they were 50 years ago in many ways? It's things like access to a good defense attorney. You know, if you can't afford your own private lawyer, you may be lucky and get a highly qualified public defender, but you might be unlucky and get some young lawyer just out of law school who's taking on a case as an assigned counsel and doesn't have much experience doing these cases. When it comes to sentencing, a defendant, a means who has an alcohol problem, can get himself into a treatment program, and the judge may think that's a good alternative. Defendant without those resources, the judge may feel, well, you need to be in prison because I can't keep you in the community unless you're in treatment. So nobody's coming out and saying, you know, because you're African American, because you're Latino, I'm going to lock you up in prison. But the overlap between race and class and how we allocate resources results in very similar kinds of outcomes.
Well, I know you track statistics, and they're broken down, not only yourself, but other agencies, Department of Justice and what have you. In terms of states where there are very minuscule percentages of African Americans, for example, is there any particular state that really jumps out to you that has a relatively small percentage of African Americans there, but a disproportionate amount involved in the prison system?
Yeah, well, some of the states in the upper Midwest, actually, Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, have among the highest degrees of racial disparity in their use of incarceration. You know, a lot of people think, well, if you want to look at a high ratio, it must be Alabama or Mississippi, and it doesn't work out that way. Here's what's going on. In Alabama and Mississippi, a lot of African Americans are locked up, but also a lot of whites. Those are very punitive states, and so the disparity there is not as great, whereas in the upper Midwest states or some of the Northeast states, you have a lot of African Americans locked up, but not very many whites are locked up proportionally. Now, there's a lot of reasons why it plays out that way, but recent research showed that Wisconsin has the highest rate of black male incarceration in the country, and I think it just reflects a lot of the socioeconomic disparities there, a lot of ongoing racial dynamics in the criminal justice system in some of the larger cities in the state. So we're seeing this play out in very intriguing ways around the country, and I think we need to take, you know, a very localized look at what those dynamics are if we really want to make some changes.
Okay. And finally, is there any particular thing that you would like to convey to our viewers about the sentencing project, where you guys are at in terms of your metamorphosis, or any particular issue that you think that we haven't covered?
Well, you know, those of us who care about prisons, who care about the people in prisons and the like, some people think that we're a so-called prisoner rights organization and therefore we don't care about the victims and public safety and the like. The reason we work on these prison and sentencing issues is because we do care about public safety, and we think that the way it's been approached in the last several decades has not been very effective. It's certainly not very humane. We think there are much better ways to do that. You know, there's no artificial distinction between victims and offenders. I care a lot about people in prison. I've been victimized, members of my family and friends have been victimized. There's nothing unique about that. All Americans have experience with that. So I think the conversation needs to be, all of us have experience as victims and either offenders, or we know people been through that. So how do we use our resources? How do we build on our communities? What's the balance of approaches we need? Public safety is a product of a lot of factors. It's your family, it's your school, it's economic opportunity, and it's also the criminal justice system. Over the last 40 years, we've gotten very much out of balance. So far too many cases we rely on prison and only prison as a way of dealing with crime. And that's not very effective, and it's certainly not very compassionate.
And how would you grade the Obama administration? I know you've been through a number of administrations. How would you grade them?
The Obama administration in its second term is really stepping up to the plate on criminal justice reform. Attorney General Holder has been very outspoken about the need for sentencing reform, the need to address racial disparity, restoration of voting rights for people who have been denied that. It's been very encouraging that they're really taking the lead, making this priority. We're cautiously optimistic we can actually see bipartisan legislation go through this Congress that would substantially reduce the mandatory sentences for drug offenses in particular, and restore some appropriate discretion to sentencing judges as well.
Okay. Marc, I want to thank you very much for your time.
Great.
20 years is a long time, but
I think we'll do it 20 years from now.
all
too,
right,
right?
fantastic.
See how we're
Looking
doing.
forward to it.
Good.